given that with the United States being, the hegemon of the world, we would still see conflicts worldwide. We would still see wars or proxies, happening across the world. But like you say, the implication of the United States falling as the hegemon of the world is leading, you could see the graph, power of the United States decreasing, a cascade of wars increasing. So there's like a correlation in a sense, you could argue, like you just mentioned with multipolarity. So, Professor, the first question that comes into mind is multipolarity a synonym of conflict? Will we just see a continuous conflict now that the United States, or rather the world as a whole, is not used to, or is starting to get used to a global order without the United States being the sole leader, or at least the perceived leader? Is that the norm?
I think there's a lot. I really like this question because there's a lot we can unpack with it, right? So, first of all, just I think to directly answer your question, I don't think multipolarity is a synonym for conflict, but this gets to the heart of a whole debate that international relations scholars have had for decades, going back into the Cold War, which is that is multipolarity more closely associated with conflict, or is bipolarity more stable? This was a big debate during the Cold War, was which of these systems tends to be more closely associated with conflict? Is it multipolarity? Is it bipolarity? And there were people on either side who argued, oh, well, no, multipolarity, there's more great powers to rectify things, so that should lead to more stability. There were others who said, no, bipolarity, because each of the respective major powers can kind of reel in their subordinates, if you will, their allies that are in their respective blocks. Of course, this is an abstraction of just thinking about the Cold War world, and that should lead to less conflict. So there was a whole debate back and forth about which of these is more stable, let alone then bringing in unipolarity. And there were, of course, I had already laid out the argument of why people viewed the, quote, Pax Americana or the unipolar moment as potentially being one that would bring about stability. But there were others who would point out, well, no, unipolarity can lead to just as much conflict because maybe the unipole doesn't feel constrained, right? And so they feel like they can get involved in all these conflicts and actually foment conflict. And that would, of course, be used to explain why the U.S. had the invasion of Iraq in 2003. The U.S. felt like it was in a position it could just do that. Who's going to stop them? So there's a whole debate about, which of these polarities is more or less associated with more conflict. My own view is that multipolarity tends to be associated with more conflict. I've always kind of come down on that side, mostly because, first of all, the two world wars were a product of multipolarity. And so I think that's the first thing that we can see. The second reason is that the 19th century itself was actually a time of a lot of conflict, and that was indeed a time of multipolarity. The Cold War, of course, we have to be clear, the Cold War, it's a misnomer that the Cold War was cold. There was a lot of conflict going on around the world. We've never had a year, over the past 200 plus years, there's never been a year where there has not been a war happening somewhere in the world. There's always been war. War is always happening somewhere. But there's been times where there's been more of it happening and less of it happening. And we're in one of those times where there's more of it happening, which again, to me, is consistent with this idea of multipolarity contributes to more conflict. So I think that is a big reason why we're seeing this. Now, another potential element of what your question gets at is kind of thinking about this notion of order and thinking about the phrase that it was used, that's been used a lot. And again, is another one of these phrases that's been used a lot to the point of criticism, but that is the idea of the liberal international order, right? And this is, of course, the idea that the U.S., through the unipolar moment, led this international system that's based on international trade, international institutions, rule of law. Of course, that's like another phrase used for it is rules-based order, so on and so forth. And that this would help foster peace. And indeed, that is a comment that's been used by many, many, say, U.S. presidents over the past 8 decades, has been that our liberal international order, or the international order led by the United States, helps to foster peace. Now, of course, there's still a lot of war happening, but it's, there's not the war between major powers like World War II is the idea. What we've been witnessing with the rise of multipolarity is a growing assertiveness of certain countries to not want to be part of that order. And indeed, you could view what's happening as part of this transition away from trying to create a single order for the international system, a rules-based order, and potentially the system bifurcating into two orders, right? Splitting into one where it's a U.S.-led order, quote, Western order, if you want to call it that, and the other, which is an order of Russia, China, the countries that typically have been associated through what's called BRICS, except with and of course, a couple of those countries who are BRICS countries like India and Brazil are kind of playing both sides. They're like trying to figure out which side do we want to go. And it's very clear, especially in the case of a country like India, where they're like, well, we're not fully on board with Russia and China, but we're also not fully on board with the United States. And indeed, we're going to continue to trade with Russia. And so you can see where there's like this jostling and kind of this beginning to split of the order. That is another contributor to the conflict and can be yet another reason why you would see multipolarity being associated with more conflict.
Wow. And yeah, you just touched on BRICS and how perhaps in a way there's these coalitions coming together, and that also comes into play when we see, I've also seen that you've commented on, what's happening in Yemen, especially with the Houthis, and how there was a coalition of nations, United States, you have Great Britain, you have many nations that decided to come together to prevent that and to stop the shipments, the taking of ships, and of the disruption of the Red Sea and the disruption of, oils, trade, and etc. All of those things. And so the question here is twofold, Professor, is the United States does continue to interfere, or rather intervene in the global scale. Of course, we've seen it with the war in Ukraine. We've seen it with the now recent war in Gaza. And at the same time, we're also seeing the United States falling down in the house of cards, you could say, in the international house of cards. And so the question here is, because personally speaking, of course, I'm biased. I live in the United States, but when I see them intervening, it does imply that we still have the intentions of maintaining stability. But on the other hand, like you say, with the statement of Hillary Clinton saying we need to just show that we're doing something. And so how much of this line between, actually intervening, we saw the airstrikes yesterday, in fact, versus just showing is happening, and how much will the U.S. continue to intervene in these kind of situations? Because now it's a very direct intervention with the airstrikes in Yemen versus selling guns and arms to Ukraine, or supporting the war in Gaza in Israel's perspective. And so I don't know if I'm explaining myself, but these two situations.
So I think I think you're explaining yourself very well. In that, to me, the heart of your question is we're still seeing the U.S. being caught trying, right? We're still seeing the U.S. being involved, and I think that in many ways, a lot of what you just highlighted illustrates exactly the heart of the issue. Meaning, okay, we have the U.S. involved in Ukraine. They are assisting Ukraine. They're arming Ukraine, resources, money, diplomatic support, holding together the coalition of sanctions against Ukraine. These are all things that the Biden administration has been working very hard to do since February of 2022. And of course, the U.S. has been supporting Ukraine even going back further because of Russia's annexation in 2014.
Yeah.
But then you start to layer on top of that other issues, right? There's other crises that start to come up. And of course, most notably is the war in Gaza, which, again, is another one of these conflicts that didn't come out of nowhere. It's not like, oh, wait, why is there a conflict between Israel and the Palestinians or Israel and Hamas? Like, that's unheard of. It's like, well, no, they've been fighting. They've had conflict for years. This was a conflict that kind of goes through phases in terms of becoming more escalated, less escalated. And indeed, October of 2023 was one of these escalations. Well, now all of a sudden the U.S. is like, okay, well, we've got to address this. So you right away saw where immediately there were constraints. The U.S. had resources dedicated towards Ukraine, and they're like, well, we don't have enough rockets. I mean, literally, we do not have enough munitions to send to both Ukraine and Israel because they're trying to support both of them. So they divert some of the munitions from Ukraine to Israel. Now, we can debate about whether they should have done that, and there's a whole other side of this. And of course, that's playing out right now, indeed, in the International Court of Justice with South Africa bringing the genocide charges against Israel. But to at least set that aside for now, the main point is just that you saw the U.S. is right away like resource constraint. We can't support both of these to the level that we need to. Then, or at least that we want to. Then on top of that, you now have a knock-on effect or a related conflict, a conflict related to Gaza, which is, of course, the conflict happening in the Red Sea with the Houthis, that they're attacking these ships. Primarily, their claim for attacking the ships is that these are ships that are destined to send arms or supplies to Israel, and we're doing this as an effort to try to stop those because of the war in Gaza, and also as a form of punishment for the West for supporting Israel. And now you see the U.S., along with coalition partners, trying to address that problem, right? And that is one that at least the U.S. is somewhat well positioned to address because the U.S. Navy is, of course, one of the main entities that's addressing that problem. The Navy is not as involved in the other two conflicts. But it points that, okay, yet again, here's another conflict that now the U.S. has to get involved with. And if you start layering these conflicts on top of each other, and you see this cascading of conflicts, you can start to see where it's like there's too many conflicts in too many places too often. Something has to give. Either U.S. resources have to give, or somehow they have to try to end these conflicts. And that then leads into other concerns, such as, is the U.S. going to put pressure on Ukraine to say, hey, we got too many issues, and it doesn't look like you're going to take back your territory from Russia, so could you maybe negotiate a ceasefire, right? That's kind of the next concern is if the U.S. is this constrained, then the Biden administration is going to say, is there a way to kind of relieve the pressure, but not do so by abandoning a country, but by saying, can we try to end this conflict? And so that is so to me, that's kind of the heart of your question, is that we are indeed seeing the U.S. trying still to address all these problems, but they're running into these constraints.